Welcome, everybody, to On This Day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. I'm your host for On This Day, Mike Goodpaster. Today we're going to talk about January the 15th, 1968, and the untimely death of Minnesota North star Bill Masterton, who was the only player to die from injuries suffered during an NHL game. Now, on that fateful night at the Met Center, he died 2 nights earlier on January the 13th, 1968. The Minnesota North Star center playing against the Oakland Seals carried the puck across the blue line and cut to the right while Seals defensemen Larry Cahan and Ron Harris closed in. One of their sticks tangled with Masterton's skates as he slid a pass to his wing. He lost his balance pitching forward. He didn't see the other defender who caught him with a clean check that knocked him backwards. Masterton, who was not wearing a helmet, smacked the back of his head on the ice. It sounded like a baseball bat hitting a ball, teammate Andre Boudreau recalled. Ken Lindgren, a fan watching the play about 10 rows up in a stand just above the blue line, can still visualize the impact. Lindgren said, "We watched his head bounce. He didn't move after that. It got deathly quiet." Boudreau helped the team's trainer onto the ice to tend to Masterton. The team doctor soon joined him. They carried Masterton off on a stretcher and in an ambulance rushed him to Fairview Southdale Hospital 7 miles away. His eyes were gray at the time. It was like a horror picture, Boudreau said. "I knew he was done." A team of doctors at the hospital treated Masterton with steroids and diuretics, but the swelling in his brain was so swift and severe that they decided against operating. Realizing he was already gone, Masterton's parents, who had flown in from Winnipeg after they heard of the incident, and his wife Carol made the decision to remove Masterton from life support at 1:55 a.m. on January the 15th, 1968, almost 30 hours after he was struck his head on the ice. Bill Masterton died at the age of 29. 7 hours later, when the Hennepin County Medical Examiner performed an autopsy, they discovered the true cause of Masterton's death. Now, like many Canadian boys growing up in the 50s, Masterton listened to Saturday night radio broadcasts of Hockey Night in Canada and dreamed of Foster Hewitt making the call. Masterton shoots, he scores. That dream carried him through junior hockey in his hometown of Winnipeg and 3 years at the University of Denver, where he was an All-American and led the Pioneers to the 1961 NCAA championship. But the dream stalled after 2 years of minor hockey in the Montreal Canadiens organization. He finished with a master's degree in business at Denver, landed a job at a Minneapolis-based technology company called Honeywell, where he worked in the financial department for the Apollo project, married his high school sweetheart, and started a family, adopting a son and a daughter. The NHL's expansion from 6 to 12 teams in 1967-68 season rekindled his mothballed dream. He had kept fit by playing on a barnstorming amateur team, the St. Paul Steers, and with the U.S. national team. When Minnesota executives who had acquired his rights invited him to a tryout, Masterton relished a second chance. He made the North Stars and actually scored the first goal in franchise history. Masterton was not a marquee player, but he was a skilled playmaker who was willing to work in the corners and be a team player. Murray Williamson, who coached both amateur teams Masterton played for, remembered a night in Rochester, Minnesota, when Masterton backed into a radiator in the dressing room and singed his rear end. He played that game standing up, Williamson said. He was a team man off the charts. Masterton was soft-spoken and modest, a quiet guy with a good sense of humor. He cherished his son, Scott, who was 3, and daughter Sally, who was 1. In the week before his last game, Masterton had complained to his wife and several teammates about headaches. He had been checked hard into the glass, yes, less yielding than it is nowadays, 2 weeks earlier in a game against the Boston Bruins. He bore the bruises of that hit and others in subsequent games on his left arm, both thighs, and unwittingly his brain. The night before the Oakland game, Masterton's family gathered at the house of a neighbor, North Star goaltender Cesar Menegio, to celebrate his 29th birthday. Masterton told his friend he had been having severe migraines. Masterton had not told the North Stars coach, Ren Blair, about his headaches, but Blair had thought something might be amiss and commented to the team trainer, "I wonder if we could have him checked." Now, that was all according to the Toronto Star, which first reported this story late May of 2011. They didn't have it checked, but even if they had, he still might have been in a lineup against Oakland on that night. "You know the diagnosis of a concussion back in those days?" asked Williamson. who has a photo hanging in his office of Masterton on the stretcher. You hold on to 4 fingers. If the guy only sees 2, you send him 2 back out there because it doesn't matter anyways. Masterton was an unfortunate victim of the ignorance of the times. Even as Walter Bush, one of the North Star owners, saw him lying motionless on the ice, he did not think Masterton sustained a concussion. We didn't really know concussions in those days, said Bush, who's now 88 years old. I've been knocked out myself playing football. We didn't think it was anything serious. Now, awareness about brain injuries and how to treat them has come a long way since then. So has NHL protocol, which was initiated in 2011, which has spotters to flag potentially concussed players and bans those from returning to games in which they were injured. But that does not happen fast enough for a group of men, more than 120 ex-NHL players like Bernie Nichols, Steve Payne, who, have sued the league in a class action suit. Yet players such as Masterton learned to play hurt back then. That's what men did, whether it was the NHL or the NFL. That was the NHL's code. And in Masterton's case, it probably cost him his life. So the specter of Masterton's death hung over the NHL All-Star Game, which was played in Toronto the next day, January the 16th, 1968, and talk centered on the divisive topic of helmets. Masterton had worn a helmet when he played college hockey in Denver because NCAA regulations required players to wear them, but he did not wear one as a professional. Only a handful of NHL players wore them at that time, including Masterton's teammates, Boudreau. Now, you protect your elbow, your hips, your knees, and hands. I figured, why not protect my head, said Boudreau, now 74 years old. It took the NHL more than a decade to catch up to that logic. For the 1979-80 season, the league finally made helmets mandatory for new players, allowing those who had signed professional contracts prior to June 1st, 1979, the option not to wear them. But it would be 18 years before every NHL player complied. In 1968, Boudreau was the only North Star who wore a helmet. Typical of the attitude of the day, North Star's coach Ren Blair frowned on the practice of wearing helmets. He and others considered it a sign of weakness. They thought it took away from the fan experience, masking the identity of the players. I was asked to take it off, Boudreau said. I wouldn't do it. The following season, Blair traded him, and he scored the second most points for the team in its first season. Now, Boudreau is convinced his insistence on wearing a helmet factored into Blair's decision to trade him. He's also convinced a helmet would have saved Masterton's life. There's no doubt in my mind about that, Boudreau says, by looking back at it now. Yet that might not actually be the case, as Masterton was off balance at the time he got checked, and he was checked cleanly. There was no penalty called. His brain twisted inside of his skull before his head struck the ice. The rotation was a contributing factor in the severity of the injuries. Now, when you look at this, helmets are great to absorb blunt impact. But when the brain is spinning, helmets don't help the spinning contents slow down. A helmet obviously would not have made Masterton's situation worse, but it might not have been enough to spare his life, given the nature of his injury and the fact that he had not healed from a recent concussion. So, after Masterton's death, the North Stars set up a scholarship fund in his name. The team also retired his number 19, a tradition the franchise continued to honor even when it moved and became the Dallas Stars. Back at the 1968 All-Star Game, discussion among beat writers went beyond the helmet debate to come up with a way to commemorate the league's first casualty. The Professional Hockey Writers Association proposed, and the league immediately approved, that the Bill Masterton Memorial Trophy to be awarded annually to the player who best exemplifies the virtues of perseverance, courage, and sportsmanship that Masterton had displayed throughout his career. It's a fine tribute to a respected player who exhibited those virtues himself, but it's regrettable that it ever came to be. Masterton's death could have been prevented, and would be prevented today probably. When he had the headaches early on, they probably wouldn't have had him on the ice. And it's a shame that nobody realized until the last decade or so, whether it's the NFL or the NHL or any sport, just what a headache can mean and the dangers that a player has with concussions, headaches, and anything like that. So, On this day, January the 15th, 1968, we remember the life and the death of Bill Masterton, the only death from an NHL hockey game, and hopefully it'll be the last. So, once again, you can hear On This Day every day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network, so make sure you check back with us, and you can hear all of our shows on iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher, wherever you find podcasts, you'll find the Grueling Truth. So, for Mike Goodpaster, you've been listening to the Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.